Her name was Emily Carter. At least, that's the name on her driver's license, her lease agreement, and the faded employee badge investigators later found in a box under her bed. Emily was 32 years old, quiet and easy to miss. She lived in a small rented apartment outside Columbus, Ohio. No husband, no children, no close family nearby. To the world, she was ordinary, almost invisible. Neighbors described her the same way. She kept to herself, always polite. I barely remember her. That was the first mistake everyone made. Emily worked as an administrative assistant at a mid-sized construction company. She arrived early, left on time, and never complained. She brought her own lunch. She avoided office gossip. When coworkers talked about promotions, bonuses, or office politics, Emily stayed silent, eyes on her screen, fingers moving steadily across the keyboard. What no one understood then was that Emily wasn't quiet because she was weak. She was quiet because she was listening. This documentary begins with a crime that shocked an entire department. But to understand how it happened, investigators had to go back, months earlier, to a moment no one thought mattered. It started with a file. According to internal records, Emily was assigned to organize financial documents for a new housing project. Nothing unusual, just numbers, emails, invoices. But buried deep inside the system was a second set of accounts. Payments that didn't match, signatures that didn't belong, approvals that were never requested. Emily noticed. At first, she thought it was a mistake. Then she saw the pattern. Large sums of money were being moved through shell companies. Safety reports were altered. Inspection dates were changed. And every digital trail led back to the same three names: men who sat in corner offices and laughed during meetings. Emily did what employees are told to do. She reported it. That's when everything changed. Emails went unanswered. Meetings were canceled. Her access to files was restricted. Then came the warning: quiet, informal, delivered with a smile. Be careful, Emily. You don't want to misunderstand things. 2 weeks later, she was reassigned. Her desk moved to a windowless corner. Her workload doubled. Her performance reviews dropped without explanation. To her coworkers, it looked like Emily was failing. To Emily, it looked like punishment. Investigators would later discover something else during this time. While Emily appeared to withdraw, eating alone, speaking less, keeping her head down, her personal notebooks told a different story. Dates, names, times, conversations rewritten word for word. She wasn't spiraling, she was documenting. What no one realized was that Emily had already stopped asking for help. She had stopped believing in systems, policies, and protections. And somewhere between being ignored and being erased, she made a decision. Not loud, not dramatic, just final. At this point in the story, authorities believed Emily was the victim, a woman pushed aside, a whistleblower silenced, someone who lost everything. But that theory wouldn't last long, because while everyone thought Emily was alone, she was already building something, and it was much bigger than revenge. After the assignment, Emily Carter slowly vanished from office life. Coworkers noticed small changes first. She stopped joining team lunches. She deleted her social media accounts. Her desk became almost empty. No photos, no decorations, no signs of personality. It was as if she was erasing herself before anyone else could. Management believed the pressure had broken her. Investigators later learned the opposite was true. Security footage from nearby stores showed Emily buying things that didn't match her quiet lifestyle: cheap prepaid phones, external hard drives, notebooks, and old second-hand cameras. Nothing illegal, nothing suspicious on its own, But when detectives reviewed the timeline later, they realized these purchases marked the beginning of something organized, something planned. At the same time, strange events started happening inside the company. Emails were sent from anonymous accounts asking questions about safety violations. Local reporters received unsigned packages containing copies of inspection reports. A community activist group suddenly gained access to internal company documents. No one connected these actions to Emily. Why would they? She looked exhausted, defeated, almost invisible. Supervisors described her as emotionally drained. One coworker told investigators she seemed like she was ready to quit any day. But Emily didn't quit. Instead, she began forming quiet connections outside the office. Phone records later revealed regular calls to 3 people: a retired journalist known for exposing corruption, a construction worker injured on one of the company's sites, and a woman whose brother had died in a building collapse linked to the same firm. At first, investigators thought these people were helping Emily heal. Later, they realized they were helping her build a case. Meanwhile, inside the company, tension grew. One of the executives, Daniel Reeves, reported that confidential meetings were being leaked. Another executive claimed someone was recording conversations. IT staff searched for hackers, but found nothing. Because the threat wasn't digital, it was human. Emily continued to work quietly. She took notes during meetings no one else attended. She volunteered to organize storage rooms where old documents were kept. She stayed late scanning files that were scheduled to be destroyed. And still, everyone believed she was alone. Then came the first major incident. A local news station aired an investigative segment accusing the company of falsifying safety inspections. The report included documents that only a small number of employees had ever seen. Public pressure exploded overnight. Lawsuits began appearing. Executives held emergency meetings behind closed doors. And for the first time, management looked at Emily differently. Not with pity, with suspicion. They searched her computer but found nothing unusual. Her emails were clean, her work records were normal. There was no clear evidence connecting her to the leaks. But something about her silence felt dangerous. What they didn't know, and what investigators would only uncover months later, was that Emily had already created layers between herself and her actions. Information passed through other people. Evidence moved through secure drop boxes. Conversations were never recorded in obvious places. She had learned from being ignored, and she had learned from being watched. By the end of this chapter, the public believed a mysterious whistleblower network was exposing corruption inside the company. Authorities believed multiple insiders were involved, but the truth was simpler and far more unsettling. Because while executives searched for a group, they still hadn't realized one quiet woman was guiding everything from the shadows. By the time federal investigators stepped in, the story had already taken a dark turn. The media needed a face, the public needed a villain, and the company needed someone to blame. That person became Emily Carter. It started subtly. Anonymous tips suggested she had accessed restricted files. A coworker claimed she asked strange questions. Another said she seemed angry after being reassigned. Old performance reviews were reinterpreted as signs of instability. The narrative shifted fast. Emily was no longer the ignored employee. She was the disgruntled one, the problem, the possible threat. Investigators interviewed her for the first time on a cold November morning. She arrived alone, wearing the same plain coat she had owned for years. She answered every question calmly. Her voice never shook. She denied leaking documents, she denied working with reporters, she denied everything. And technically, she was telling the truth. There was no direct evidence tying her to the leaks, no fingerprints on envelopes, no digital trail linking her to anonymous accounts. Every accusation against her was built on assumptions. Still, suspicion followed her everywhere. Her access at work was fully revoked. Security escorted her to and from the building. At home, she noticed cars parked across the street for hours at a time. Friends she barely spoke to stopped answering messages altogether. Emily had become isolated, exactly as planned. Because what investigators didn't realize was that Emily needed to be seen as the villain. Court documents later revealed that during this period, someone else stepped into the spotlight: Daniel Reeves, the senior executive who had first warned Emily to be careful. Publicly, he portrayed himself as a victim of internal sabotage. Privately, he was scrambling. Unknown to him, Emily had already recorded their first conversation months earlier, not digitally, but written down, word for word, minutes after it happened. She had done this with dozens of interactions, cross-checked them, dated them, stored copies in multiple locations. And she wasn't the only one collecting evidence anymore. The injured construction worker had filed a civil lawsuit. The journalist was preparing a long-form exposé. Families of victims were organizing, but Emily stayed silent. To outsiders, it looked like she was breaking. She missed work, she skipped interviews, she stopped responding to emails. Rumors spread that she was unstable, possibly dangerous. Then she disappeared. Her apartment was found empty, clothes gone, computer missing, no forwarding address, no goodbye note, just a few personal items left behind, as if she had walked away in a hurry. Authorities issued a quiet alert. Media headlines asked if the whistleblower had finally run. That assumption was the second mistake. Because Emily hadn't disappeared to escape consequences, she had disappeared to remove herself from the story, and in doing so, she allowed someone else to step forward. 2 weeks later, Daniel Reeves was arrested. Financial fraud, obstruction of justice, evidence tampering. The company collapsed under investigation. Stock prices fell, executives resigned. The public celebrated. Justice, they said, had been served. But one question remained unanswered. If Daniel Reeves was guilty, why did so many leaked documents still remain unexplained? And why, in the final days before her disappearance, had Emily transferred ownership of her storage unit to someone else? Investigators would eventually open that unit, and what they found inside forced them to rethink everything they believed about Emily Carter. Because maybe she was never the villain. The storage unit was opened 6 months after Emily Carter disappeared. By then, the case had cooled. Daniel Reeves was awaiting trial. The company was bankrupt. Most investigators believed Emily had fled, either out of fear or guilt. The unit was considered an afterthought, signed over legally to a third party whose name meant nothing at the time. But when detectives finally cut the lock, everything changed. Inside were neatly labeled boxes. Not random, not rushed, organized. Each box contained notebooks, folders, and printed emails. There were timelines stretching back years, long before Emily ever reported anything. Safety violations connected to multiple projects, internal memos rewritten to hide risks, names that had never appeared in the investigation. And then there was the wall. Photographs were pinned in a pattern investigators didn't recognize at first. Executives, inspectors, politicians, journalists, even whistleblowers. Some were marked in red, some in black. Emily hadn't just been documenting corruption, she had been mapping people. For the first time, authorities questioned their own version of events. The leaks hadn't been random, they had been timed, controlled, released only when they caused maximum pressure. Daniel Reeves hadn't been exposed first because he was the most guilty. He had been exposed because he was the weakest. Buried deeper in the unit was a sealed envelope addressed to the journalist Emily had been calling. Inside was a letter, written in calm, simple language. "I did not start this. I only decided how it would end." That sentence changed the tone of the entire investigation. Phone records were reanalyzed, interviews were reopened. Slowly, a new picture formed. Emily had never worked alone, but she was never part of a group either. She acted as a connector, a quiet coordinator. She gave people just enough information to act on their own anger, their own grief. She didn't force anyone. She simply showed them the truth, and then stepped back. This is where the line between justice and revenge began to blur, because some of the outcomes were extreme. A building inspector linked in Emily's notes had taken his own life days before a scheduled testimony. A city official resigned after anonymous evidence reached his family. One former executive disappeared overseas with no extradition treaty. None of these acts could be legally tied to Emily, but all of them followed her timeline. Investigators now asked a dangerous question. Had Emily predicted these outcomes or planned for them? The final item in the storage unit was a small voice recorder. No dates, no labels, just one recording. Emily's voice was steady. "They thought I was alone. That made them careless. If this is being heard, then the story they told about me is already finished." The recording ended there. No confession, no apology. Authorities wanted to release the findings to the public, but higher agencies intervened. Too many powerful names, too many unanswered questions. The case was quietly sealed. Officially, Emily Carter remains missing. Unofficially, some investigators believe something else. They believe Emily never intended to destroy the system. She intended to expose how easily it destroys itself. And somewhere, maybe watching, maybe finished, Emily was no longer the woman no one noticed. The final twist didn't come from a courtroom. It came from a death that looked natural. 5 years after Emily Carter disappeared, Daniel Reeves died in federal prison. Official cause, cardiac arrest. No signs of violence, no last words worth recording. The case should have ended there, but one retired investigator couldn't let it go. While reviewing sealed evidence one last time, he noticed something that had been overlooked, a handwritten note found in Reeves' cell after his death. It wasn't a confession, it wasn't a plea, it was a question. How did she know about the bridge? That question reopened everything. The bridge referenced in Emily's notebooks wasn't one of the projects that collapsed. It was one that didn't. A structure quietly shut down months before completion due to budget issues. No media coverage, no investigation. Because Emily had intervened early. Buried in the sealed files was a report never made public. Emily had anonymously sent evidence to regulators about that bridge before any whistleblower scandal began. The project was halted, lives were saved. She didn't just expose corruption, she prevented disaster. That changed how investigators saw her entire plan. Emily wasn't reacting emotionally, she wasn't seeking chaos. She was choosing outcomes, deciding when exposure would protect people and when silence would let the guilty destroy themselves. Reeves' downfall wasn't revenge alone, it was containment. And then came the final reveal. 3 months after Reeves' death, a nonprofit investigative organization received a donation, large, anonymous. Attached was a hard drive with one message: "Release this only if the pattern starts again." The files on that drive contained updated timelines, new names, and current projects, proof that Emily had never stopped watching. She wasn't hiding, she was waiting. Authorities never admitted it publicly, but internal memos confirmed their fear. Emily Carter was no longer a person of interest. She was a deterrent. In this documentary, we ask the question no report ever answered. Was Emily a criminal, a hero, or something more dangerous? Someone who understood the system so well, she learned how to correct it without permission. They thought she was alone. They thought silence meant weakness. They were very wrong. Because Emily Carter didn't disappear. She became the reason no one felt safe cutting corners ever again. And that is the part of the story they never wanted you to hear.